Minnesota, Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you, here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for listening to the show. If you have any questions or comments, you can send them to comment@am950radio.com, and I will answer them during the show. So on today's show, as I mentioned last week, we're going to, the big horrible bill passed, unfortunately. Passed the House, Senate, President signed it, and so now it's become law. So I'm going to talk about a little bit more about that bill and some of the effects that it's going to have on our economy. So that's like the last couple of segments. And this first segment, we're going to be talking about the last amendment to the Constitution. So after today's show, we'll be all done with the Constitution. Although on future shows, I think I'm going to talk about perhaps some proposed amendments or proposed amendments that some, a number of people support or are trying to get Congress to kind of look at. So probably bring up some of those in some future episodes. But today we're going to finish off the Constitution with the 27th Amendment. So this is kind of this one has a little bit of history to it, so I'll be getting into that here in a minute. But this is also one of the shortest amendments. It's only one sentence long. It has 24 words in it, but it's only one sentence long. And it was passed, ratified by enough states on May 7th, 1992. So this is the last one we've had that's been ratified. And I don't think the only one that I'm aware of that some people are trying to get passed or argue has already passed, but there's some problems with it, is the Equal Rights Amendment. But that is not an official amendment yet. So this 27th one is the last one, and it's back in 1992 on May 7th. So here is the text to it. No law varying the compensation for the services of the senators and representatives shall take effect until an election of representatives shall have intervened. And that's it. Again, one of the shorter ones. But basically what this means is that if Congress gives itself a raise, although you can make an argument, well, it just says compensation, so maybe even if it cuts its pay. Although Congress has only, as far as I could tell, has only cut its pay once. And that wasn't for very long during the Depression, the Great Depression. So, but basically this means if Congress gives itself a pay increase, it cannot go into effect. In other words, they can't get the money until there's been an election of the House of Representatives in the meantime. In other words, the House is every 2 years we have an election for the House. So before any pay increase can go into effect, there has to be an election for the House. And that'll also be 1/3 of the Senate is also up in one of those elections too. So they got to wait. They can't just do it and get the money right away. So this gives the voters, if they're paying attention or if they really care about it, and let's hope that they do. But basically, this allows voters to vote out some members of Congress after they give themselves a pay raise. That's kind of the main thing here. Another part of this is you will note from the language that it talks about a law. So that means Congress is the one that gives itself a pay raise. It is not the president, it is not the court systems, but it is Congress itself. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this is basically a chance for the people to have an election before the pay raise kicks in, so that if they want to get rid of some of those members of the House, at least, and 1/3 of the Senate, they have a chance to vote how they want to about that. So it gives a little bit of accountability to the people to justify their raises. So, part of this idea here is that, if Congress is able to do it immediately, that, there could be some corruption there potentially, right? And who knows how big of a pay raise they would give themselves. So there's this, you got to wait. Plus, it allows it to be the raise to be in future budgets too before it actually kicks in. So, again, very short amendment, but there's some interesting history to this one. So that's what the majority of this segment is going to be about. But I had talked way back when we first started talking about the amendments. The Bill of Rights were the first 10 amendments. I had mentioned that James Madison, who basically, got the suggestions from Congress, because the first Congress did these proposals, and he wrote them up. He wrote up 12 initially, right? So 10 were the Bill of Rights, and there were 2 extras that went out to the states, but the states did not ratify them. Well, the 27th Amendment was one of those that the states did not ratify initially. It was part of the package, the very first ones that were approved by Congress, but in this case, not enough states ratified it back in 1789, or even a little bit later when the Bill of Rights were in 1791. So this was part of the original proposed 12 amendments, and that phases into the history here, as I'll get to in a little bit here. But so back in when it was first put out there to the states, only 7 of them ratified it. And remember, you need 3/4. So back then, when they first came out with the number of states we had, you needed 10 states to get the 3/4, and they only got 7, so it didn't pass. But as we've talked before with other amendments, on this one there was no end date on it. Right, we've covered some of the amendments where it says Congress, passes this, and the states have like 7 years to approve it or something. This one didn't have any that kind of language on it. It just, had the what was on the amendment that I read. That's all it had. So there was no end date on it. So this one didn't have any. So it just kind of stayed out there in limbo land for a while, right? And then it was brought up in a few states, over time, but not very many. And I'll get to that here in a second. But when you look back on this particular amendment, historians and political scientists basically credit a student named Gregory Watson. He was a student at the University of Texas in Austin, and he wrote a paper in 1982. And I actually remember all of this stuff because I was in college in 1982 also. And I remember all this stuff kind of was going on. And Gregory Watson wrote a paper for one of his classes saying that this amendment could still be ratified because there was no end date on it. And if you recall, in Article 5 of the Constitution that deals with, amending it, it doesn't say anything in there about, you only have so much time to amend, consider amending it. Nothing in there. And in 1939, there was a Supreme Court decision that basically concluded if the amendments don't have an end date on them, you can still ratify them. Congress can change the end dates or put in, some time frame if they want, but the Supreme Court, there was a Supreme Court decision that basically said, well, if there's no end date on it, it's still good. They didn't want to make that sort of a political decision. So after Watson wrote this paper, he decided to do a nationwide campaign to get it ratified. And some of the historians say, part of why he did this is because he only got a C on his paper for a grade. So he was a little miffed about that. So he's like, okay, I'm going to show you. And he led a nationwide campaign to get this ratified. He had some help and stuff, but he was like the guy that started this whole new effort to ratify this amendment. And ultimately it worked. So he wrote letters to, all the different state legislatures that had not yet passed it. And there were a number of states in the 1980s that then ratified it. So back in history, in 1873, Ohio had actually ratified the amendment. And then in 1978, not too long before he wrote his paper, and maybe that was part of what kind of got him interested in this. In 1978, the state of Wyoming ratified the amendment. But it still wasn't enough until, because we have a lot more states now at this time in the 1970s and 1980s. So there weren't enough states yet that had ratified it. So, this paper and him doing this nationwide campaign brought a big, attention to it, and a lot of people got interested in it. So a number of states in the 1980s, in particular, ratified it. So Minnesota ratified this on May 22nd, 1989, is when the Minnesota legislature did it. So they became the 32nd state to ratify it. And by then you need 38, like you do now. So there were some states that ratified it after we got it, and then they got up to 38 and passed 38. And that's why it was ratified in 1992. That was when they got 38 states. So 4 states have not ratified it, as far as I could tell. Those 4 are Massachusetts, Mississippi, New York, and Pennsylvania. So again, this is not uncommon. We've talked before about once there's enough states that have ratified the amendment, some states just don't deal with it anymore. Now, there are some states that still go through it and either ratify it or not, but many states just say, well, it's passed, so we're not going to take it up. So in this case, 4 states did not take it up. So, but there were also some issues, though, on top of, this history of it. So when 38 states had done it, had ratified it, the archivist, for the Constitution, that's the person that basically, says that this is now part of the Constitution, right? Normally, the archivist typically waits for a resolution from Congress accepting the amendment. So normally Congress meets and says, yeah, now there's enough states, and we are going to add this amendment to the Constitution, right? Congress does some sort of resolution. But the archivist did not wait for Congress here. He just did it when there was enough states. So there were some people in Congress who objected to his certificate of ratification that he did. So Congress, they had some debate about this, but ultimately Congress accepted it and did a concurrent resolution, it was called, on May 92. So, roughly 2 weeks after the archivist did his certificate of ratification. So, it won easily in Congress. But, there was some debate about that. And for those of you that recall, there's some debate over what the Equal Rights Amendment and whether the archivist under President Biden should have added it to the Constitution. Maybe I'll do something about that on a future show. But there was another issue, though, if that wasn't enough, right? Another issue was the state of Kentucky. It appeared that Kentucky had actually adopted the amendment back in 1792. But there was some dispute over whether that actually happened, apparently. So in 1996, so after it was ratified, but Kentucky still voted to reaffirm its ratification. So it became one of the states that ratified it. But there was some question whether they did or didn't back in 1792. So they redid it, essentially. So interestingly, over the years, Congress has kind of changed the way they paid themselves. So initially, it was a per diem position. In other words, they charged themselves per day that they were in session. You know, and now it's a salaried position. But there's been times in our history where it's been a per diem or a per day number. So from 1789, when Congress first started, to 1815, it was $6 a day that they were in session is what they got paid. Then from 1815 to 1817, they changed that to a salary of $1,500 per year. So $1,500 back then was, pretty decent money. Then they changed it again in 1817 to 1855. It was $8 a day. So they went back to the per diem or per day system. And then in 1855 to the present time, it's been salary ever since then. In 1855, the salary was $3,000 per year. Now it is $174,000 is what they get paid currently. This has been the same number since 2009. So Congress hasn't given itself any pay raise since 2009. And depending on what you think of Congress, a lot of people are glad they haven't given themselves a raise. I haven't heard of anything saying they will. But thing to remember here is this only deals with their salary. Of course, they get a lot of money through campaign donations, through dark money, through all sorts of corruption that's going on. I mean, this current administration is just a bunch of grifters, right? So, I mean, people in Congress aren't really there for the money, the salary position. It's all the other money that they get, right? So that's it with the 27th Amendment. So now we are done with all the amendments and done with the Constitution. I'll have to think of something to do next now for a series here. But again, I'm probably going to talk about some perhaps proposed amendments here in the future. So I'll have to think of something, another feature for starting the next week's show. But again, I've talked before about how I'm going to probably talk about fascism. So I'll probably keep doing that here. So as we go to break, I'm going to talk about some of the ramifications of the big, horrible bill and a little bit of economics. How's the big, horrible bill going to affect our economy? So I'll talk about that actually for the next two segments. Lots to cover there. So we will talk to you on the other side of the break. You are listening to Politics Matters.
Those crazy nights I do remember in my youth. I do recall those were the best times.
All right, welcome back to Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for listening to the show. Again, if you have any comments or questions, send them to comment@am950radio.com, and I'll answer them during the show. All right, so as I predicted last week, the big, horrible bill passed. The House and the Senate and the President signed it on the 4th of July, of course. Right, it's just another part of the big show that he does. So, I've covered what's, part of the bill, the House version, what was in the Senate version, and now I'm going to cover just some of the ramifications that this bill is going to have, not only, politically, but also some economics here. Right, so that'll actually be the next two segments. That'll be the rest of the show because there's just so much there, and I'm actually limiting myself here a little bit because there's just so much. So, first of all, And this is I got a question about this. So I'm going to answer, as I said, I answer your questions on the show. So here's one. I was asked, well, why do you think the Republicans passed this big horrible bill, even though the people didn't like it? So here's some reasons. First, because it comes down to the actual action on voting, just ram it through because they could. Right? I talked about this way back when I first started the show. It's like they got the numbers. And typically when Republicans have the numbers, they ram through what they want. They may get people, they'll you saw how some people complained about, this is, people are going to get kicked off Medicaid. And I talked about last week about how some of the cowards in the Senate, right, made these big speeches and then voted to support it. So, when you're listening to Republicans, right, they say a lot of stuff, but you got to judge them by their actions. And they all voted for it. There were a few in the Senate that didn't, but and a couple in the House, but that's why they did it. This is what they've done in the past. This is why, when you have a majority in the House and the Senate, you can do that, right? And this is one of the, elections have consequences, and the Democrats didn't show up in 2024, and look where we are. And this is a consequence of it. Right? Another reason why I thought they would do it is because they did it in 2017 during Trump won. Right? That's it. Basically, their only main legislative action was the 2017 tax cuts for their rich donors. And many of those tax cuts were expiring at the end of 2025. So they needed to pass another one to make those tax cuts permanent, which they did, unfortunately, in this new law. Secondly, this was all laid out in Project 2025 in various, parts of it. Right? I covered Project 2025, not all of it, because it was, 900 plus pages, but this was all laid out in there. They were going to extend these, they were going to, pay off their donors, all this stuff, right? This is what the Trump administrations and the Republican fascists are doing, right? They're implementing Project 2025. This was a part of it. Third reason is usually big bills are typically done first after you win an election, when you get the trifecta, right, of the House, Senate, and the President. Just like the tax cuts did in 2017, this is when this was going to happen. And it did in 2025. It actually happened faster than the tax cut in 2017, which was in December, after Trump took over. Here it happened in July, so this one was done faster. But typically that's when you get these big bills done, is after, shortly after you win. Because the theory is, the people support you and all that, and it's easier to pass stuff. Next reason, if you look at a lot of the starting times on what's in these bills, you will find out that many of them don't come into play until after the 2026 midterms. Okay, so first of all, the Republicans are saying, well, maybe the people won't know that. They can say, well, none of this is kicked in yet, and things are great, so reelect us, right? And if you follow history, the Republicans know they're likely to lose the House. So they needed to get this done now. So that's why they do it. Again, this is why you typically see them done. Some of the first things get done is because in our history, a lot of times the House of Representatives in particular flips to the other party in the midterm elections. And finally, they didn't want to cross the big orange turd. Patrick, I can say turd on the radio, can't I?
Yes, you can.
All right. Just wanted to make sure. They're afraid to stand up to the bully. All right, so they, go along with him. Now, I covered some of that with the Senate last week, right? Plus, again, a lot of the fascist Republicans, I call them fascists for a reason. They love this stuff that they passed. Now, this is no shock that they passed this horrible bill. they're just placating their rich donors, and they don't care what happens to us. Right? It's more important to their donors than it is to the rest of us. I'm going to talk about some of that later, probably in the third segment. So when you put Republicans in charge, this is what happens. Now, again, this bill, the polling on it, I mean, all the polls showed that the American people didn't like it. I mean, it was underwater by a lot. I mean, it wasn't even that close. I mean, even on Fox Lies, when they did their poll, it only polled at 38% supporting it, and that was a high number of people that actually supported the bill. You know, so that's barely a third of the people in the highest poll supported this bill, but they did it anyway. So this is yet another example of how the Republican fascists ignored their own voters and went with the demands of their rich donors. You know, this wasn't a bill that polled like 50-50 or 50-45 or 55-45 or anything like that. I mean, it was just in the tank. But they did it anyway. And if you look at studies that look at this sort of thing, it's like, well, why do politicians pass stuff that the people don't like? I thought this was a majoritarian country, right? I talked about this, earlier. Like, well, the majority should rule, and stuff like that. And why doesn't Congress pass stuff that the majority of the people want? Well, this is another example of why they don't. The rich typically get what they want, and we don't. So, of course, the rich wanted these tax cuts extended, and they got it. And the way to pay for that, under the reconciliation process, as I discussed previously, is you got to cut stuff. And so this is basically theft from us to give to the rich people. Plus, this is what happens when the rich have taken over the government, like we have today. So if you want to change that and get back to, quote, regular, close quote, people, back in Congress, well, you got to vote out a lot of these people, which is not an easy thing to do because, the rich can literally buy off the politicians. But, we still got to try and do it, or it's only going to get worse. So, we need to take our government back. So that's kind of a long answer to the question, but nonetheless an important, went through some important things there. It's like, why is this stuff going on? So here are some of the ways that this bill, some of the harm that's going to be inflicted on us. So number one, they added at least, and I think this is going to be a higher number, $4 to $5 trillion in debt to our national debt, which now has topped the $37 trillion mark. So let's not forget that under Trump 1, he added roughly 1/4 of this amount to the debt. And a big part of that was the 2017 tax cuts. Well, what do you think is going to happen now that these have been made permanent? So this $4 to $5 trillion number, I think, is too small because it does not take into account the loss of revenue that's also going to occur with all of these cuts. And with all the people with less money, they're not going to go out and spend money in the economy, which is going to cause the federal government to borrow more money to cover their expenses and to cover the interest that they're already paying on that $37 trillion debt, and which is going to go up. We're already paying over $1 trillion in interest on that national debt. And that number is only going to go up. Number two, it's going to kick off. I've seen various numbers. The highest number that I've seen is 17 million people from Medicaid. I've seen some other lower numbers like 11 or 12 or 13. But, the point here is it's over 10 million people if you look at all of the projections. They're going to lose their health care coverage from Medicaid. Why? Well, again, it's to pay for the tax cuts for the rich people. This is going to be the largest transfer of wealth in United States history. I will say that again. This is going to be the largest transfer of wealth in the United States history. Okay, so you remember all the people that did not have insurance before the Affordable Care Act was passed? Okay, that's roughly the same number of people, I think the low number, that are going to get kicked off of Medicaid. So we're going to be back to those numbers of uninsured people. Not to mention all the disabled people that are going to no longer be covered, and all the people in nursing homes that are no longer going to be covered. So in this big, horrible bill, Congress established a $50 billion slush fund to cover some of the hospital costs. So if you divide 50 billion by 50 states, that's 1 billion per state. That's not enough to stop many hospitals from closing. That's not even going to come close. And there's a hospital in Nebraska that already closed. You know, literally like within, I don't even think it was a day. And they already came out and said they were going to close, you know, after the president signed it. Because they just can't afford it. And I have a feeling there's going to be more and more and more states or hospitals doing that when these Medicaid cuts become effective. By the way, again, these are not, I don't think for Medicaid, it's not going to be till after the 2026 midterms. But they're still going to happen. So states are going to have to raise their taxes to get more money to pay for, you know, to help pay these hospitals if they want to keep them open. And as I said before, when they go, rural hospitals go, you're going to lose your rural schools because these rural hospitals are typically the largest employer, and you know you're going to have people leaving these small towns, so the schools are going to go too. You know, not to mention the nursing homes closing. You know, a lot of them are going to close too, not just the hospitals. And in many of these rural towns and cities, you know, a nursing home is one of the bigger employers as well. Well, what's going to happen when they go? Next one. Electricity costs are going to be 30% higher. Again, I think that number might even be higher than that. Well, why is that going to happen? Well, because under this big, horrible bill, they're closing off all the tax credits that were there during the Biden administration when they passed their infrastructure bill. They got rid of them all. So what's going to happen here is that you're going to have an energy shortage because there's going to be, less solar, less wind, right? Less alternative, green energy. And we're going to go back to the fossil fuel crap that does result in some energy shortages. Just ask the state of Texas. They've gone through that before. And also by, cutting all these tax credits so businesses aren't going to be, doing as much as this, you're going to lose jobs. All these, manufacturing jobs are going to go away. So, get ready for more pollution, more fossil fuel consumption, more climate change, all the things that are ravaging the state of Texas right now. Another one is the biggest ever food assistance cut, or SNAP benefits, for family, kids, and veterans. So, there's going to be less food available for people in need. And where's that money going? Well, we know where a big chunk of it's going, right? ICE, Immigration and Custom Enforcement, that's what it stands for. Their budget is being jacked up to $170 billion, those associated with the immigration. That's where that money, part of that, all these cuts, that's going. Now, the ICE budget for $170 billion is more than many countries spend on their entire military. Right? And if you saw what happened in Los Angeles on Monday, Trump is going to try to turn this country into a police state. Right? They had ICE members in Humvees and horseback and things rolling through a park in Los Angeles. Didn't arrest anybody, but they just did it all for the show. Right? That's where some of these SNAP benefit cuts are going, and Medicaid cuts are going. They're going to inflate the budget of ICE. And all these cuts will cause people to borrow more money, to pay for their stuff, pay for their medical bills, pay for food, pay for stuff for their family. And, they're going to charge more on their credit card. So, they're going to go into more debt. We're going to get more bankruptcies, right? Medical bills are the number one reason for bankruptcy in the United States. That's going to get worse as a result of this big, horrible bill. Right? I think I'm going to take a break here, Patrick. So, because I got more to go here. Again, this segment's being basically broken down into two. So I'm going to take a break here, and when we come back, I'll continue on with this, going over the big horrible bill and the economic effects it's going to have. You're listening to Politics Matters with Bruce Klopfleisch. All right, welcome back to the third and final segment of today's show on Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. So let's continue on with how this big, horrible bill is going to have a real bad effect on our economy, I think, as well as the rest of us, the non-rich people. So Medicare. Now, notice I said Medicare here. A lot of people don't know this, but Medicare is probably going to be cut too. Because there is a law called Pay As You Go. This was back in 2010 that says that if the national debt goes up, after you do some reconciliation, right, and it goes up enough, there's some threshold that it has to meet, then you have to start cutting from Medicare. So Medicare is going to be cut too, to try and cover some of the national debt that goes up when it's higher than the number that they're projecting. So the deficits, if they if they go over that number, then it's going to trigger the Pay As You Go Act, or they call it PAYGO, of 2010. And there's projections out there that $500 billion are going to be cut from Medicare, unless Congress takes some other action to cover that money some other way. So when Republicans are out there saying, "Oh, we're not doing anything about Medicare," they're lying to you. Unless they do something else here. But if they don't, Medicare they're gonna have to make cuts from Medicare, which of course is what the Republicans want to do. You hear them all the time saying, "Well, we don't want to do this. We don't." Yeah, they do. They've been wanting to do this since Lyndon Johnson, and the Democrats passed this in the 60s. This is just another way to do it. Just trigger the PAYGO law. And this is probably going to happen. So keep that, and just keep that in the back of your head too, of what the Republicans are doing and some of the ramifications that they're not talking about with this law. Next is you hear the Republicans and Trump is out there saying, "Well, there's no tax on tips or no tax on overtime." They're lying to you about that too. What they're not telling you is that these provisions expire in 2028. So yeah, you get a few years, but that I'll give you, there's a cap on some of this too. So you might not even get to full use of it, but those two provisions expire in 2028. The rich people, they get permanent tax cuts. We get a few years. How fair is that? So, they never told you that when they passed this. And in particular, there's no tax on tips. It's also capped at $25,000 per year. So if you make over $25,000 a year in tips, you got to start paying taxes on the amount over the $25,000. Plus, you still have to pay any state or local income tax on your tip money, since Congress can only deal with the federal income tax portion of it. So your state and local government may still tax your tips. They didn't tell you about that either. right? And by the way, the tax on tips, that only deals with cash tips. You don't get to deduct the stuff that's on credit cards, which is, a lot of people put their tips on credit cards these days. Well, you don't get to take that. It's only on the cash. So here's another example of, they throw a bone or two to us, but the rich people are getting the big part of this tax cut. And this law makes worse our already too high income inequality and wealth inequality that's going on in this country. So for the rest of this segment, that's what I'm going to be talking about here. Right, we are now more unequal in the United States than all the countries in Western Europe. And when it comes to wealth and income inequality. This gets back to the theft of money from the 90% of us and giving it to the top 10%. This has been going on since Reagan started this. And Republicans have done it ever since. When they've been in power, that's what they do. So again, this was no shock to me that they passed this big, horrible bill. So here's some statistics about income and wealth inequality in the United States. So the bottom half of the people in our country. So I'm just using the rough number of 330 million people in the United States. Might be a little more than that now, but I'll just use that number. So half of the people would be 165 million of us. So the bottom half of the people, we only get 2.5% of the wealth in this country. 2.5% for half of the people in this country. They get to fight over 2.5% of the wealth. Yeah, we got to share 2.5% of the wealth in the country if you're in the bottom 50%. I mean, that's not a lot, 2.5%. Well, you may be asking, what about the next 40%? So this would be people, the next 40% up from this half. So this, you could call this maybe the middle class, right? So the next 40% of the people get to fight over 30% of the wealth in this country to share amongst themselves. So that's roughly 132 million people in this country get to split 30% of the wealth. Now, notice that this number is still less than their share of the population. So the next 40% of the people get only 30% of the wealth to fight over. So when you add that up, 90% of us in the United States of America, supposedly the freest and the fairest and blah, 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 right? The greatest country in the world. 90% of us, we get to fight over 32.5% of the wealth in this country right now. That's not even a third of the money. But, we can round it up. So that means the top 10% of the people in this country, the richest of the rich, get 67.5% of the wealth. And, it's going to get worse with this big, horrible bill. Because the rich people are going to get more of the benefit than we are under this bill. All right? The result that we're going to see is similar and probably even going to be worse than the tax cuts in 2017. So the top 10% are going to get even more money from the rest of us, 90%, because of this law. So don't be surprised if you see 90% of us are going to have to fight over less money once all this stuff kicks in. See how this works? The people who don't need any more wealth or don't need any more tax cuts are getting more, while the rest of us get to fight over the ever-shrinking crumbs that's left over, which right now is less than 1/3 of the wealth. So it's no wonder why the wealthy people, brought Trump back for a second term and gave a trifecta to the Republicans. Well, why? Well, because they get more money. Pretty simple. This isn't going to make America great again, unless you're rich. It's just going to make it worse off. Trump and the Republicans are loyal to the donors that put them, in office and finance their campaigns, and not the people that voted for them, right? Because, 90% of us get less than a third of the wealth. That's a lot of Republicans in that 90%, by the way, right? I wish they would understand more that that's what's being done to them by the orange turd, as I'm allowed to say on the radio. So, right, the donors put them in there. They finance their campaigns. As I mentioned before, this pulled horribly, but yet Congress passed it anyway. And part of this is, MAGA, right, the hardcore Republicans. They don't care how this affects them. They don't care if their hospitals close, their schools close. Their, mom has to live with them now because she can't live in a nursing home. As long as they get to own the libs, they're happy. They're fine. Even though the Trump administration and the Republican fascists are imposing even more income and wealth inequality on them and the rest of us. I mentioned before how I think more and more of us in the United States are finally seeing that this is going on. Right, an example of this is when I talked about how Zoran Mamdani's win in the Democratic primary for New York City mayor. Right, that's what he ran on. And he got, his biggest supporters were young people. So I think the Democrats got to turn this into a, us versus the rich type of campaign. Right? So, there's going to be some horrible consequences to this bill. Right? And it's just going to get worse. So one of the things that, has to be done here is this is why politics matters. Right? It affects you every day. You got to get more involved in it to protect yourself. And get the politicians to do what you want, not the other way around. So I hope I've given you some things to think about at least here. And I'll talk to you next week here on Politics Matters on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. Talk to you next week.